Today, I'm going to solve a murder. Okay, so I've seen a couple of other people do this, and I'm pretty decent at solving mysteries, particularly Agatha Christie's. I grew up on them. I've been reading them since I was a teenager, which was a minute ago. So I feel like I can do this. Today, I'm going to be reading Sparkling Cyanide. Let me tell you what it's about. 6 people sit down to a sumptuous meal at a table laid for 7. In front of the empty place is a sprig of rosemary. Rosemary for remembrance. A strange sentiment, considering no one is likely to forget the night, exactly a year ago, that Rosemary Barton died at exactly the same table, her beautiful face unrecognizable, convulsed with pain and horror. But then, Rosemary had always been memorable. She had the ability to arouse strong passions in most people she met. In one case, strong enough to kill. Okay, so that's the premise. Mostly I picked it because I haven't read it yet, and Sparkling Cyanide sounded very like Happy New Year January vibes. I'm reading it through audiobook, which is maybe not the best way. I don't have a text to reference. But essentially there's 5 parts, and my plan was to check in with you and we can share some theories at every chapter up until the end, and we'll see if I get it right. Okay, so I've already read the first part, and I'm going to give you a breakdown of the victim and all of the characters that have been introduced so far. I assume they're all suspects. We start 6 months after Rosemary's death. It's not entirely clear at first how she died. From what I can gather, Rosemary, who was like a woman in her late 20s, a wealthy woman in her late 20s, died during her birthday party with apparently suicide. Obviously not. She died by pills that they found in her handbag, and she had been crying before her death and talking about her will with her little sister, who is the first perspective that we see this crime from. Rosemary, by all accounts, was a woman who went out a lot. She had a lot of friends. She went to a lot of parties. I don't get the sense that she was like a ne'er-do-well, like one of the characters we're going to talk to, but she just like had a social life and was an extrovert and did that sort of rich people thing. Yeah, so that's Rosemary. That's our victim. It's not entirely, I don't have all the details. I'm assuming that I'll get more details once we get to the dinner part where everybody sits down and talks about it. But that is as much as I know. There were 2 clues that are introduced early on. One was that she was talking about her will before she died, even though there was no reason to believe that a young woman would die suddenly. And she had a flu that she recovered from right before her death, a bad flu, which I think is interesting considering she died by poisoning. And they mention it multiple times. She had a flu, this big flu, that caused a depression that made her commit suicide. What a time of understanding mental health in the 40s. So that's our victim. Iris is, again, the first person that we get the perspective from. She's kind of our narrator in the first part. She is, I think, about 20. She is Rosemary's little sister. She is a terrible person. Like, just doesn't see people outside of herself. The first thing she talks about is like she can't remember who Rosemary was because she was just a sister, and like she talks about how, well, you don't think of your mother as a person, you didn't think about them as people. Like, yeah, maybe you don't when you're like a child, but as an adult, yeah, my family members are people with, personalities and internal thoughts and emotions. Anyway, she lived with Rosemary after her mother died. So it would have been her and Rosemary and Rosemary's husband and the housekeeper, who we'll get to. And the whole first part is her kind of trying to go back and remember kind of the circumstances. And I'll get to some of the clues as to why she's trying to remember. Yeah. I don't think she did it. I just think she's a terrible sister for not knowing at all who her sister is, even though they live together. Um, okay, so Rosemary's husband was George Barton. George, by all accounts, took Iris in as a sister. There was no like weird, why does your sister have to live with us drama. One interesting fact that I thought was George encouraged Iris not to wear mourning after Rosemary died because Rosemary wouldn't like it. By all accounts, it seems like he liked his wife. If I imagine we'll have some evidence that he didn't later on, but by all accounts, it seems like he liked his wife and they got along. Someone else who lived with them was not their housekeeper, or like an old lady companion. I think she's related to them. I'm not entirely sure how. Lucilla Drake. Um, she's kind of like a stuffed up old lady. I don't entirely know why she's there, but she's there. I think they might be she might be related to George. I'm sure it'll clear up at some point. And then we have Victor. Victor Drake is Lucilla Drake's son. By all accounts, he's a bit of a dick. He's just leeching money off his mom. He's like, if I don't get these 30 pounds for my gambling debt, I don't know what I could possibly do. Like, he's that kind of guy. Just no personal responsibility whatsoever. We don't really know much else about him other than he's just like a ne'er-do-well. Then we find out Iris finds a note in one of Rosemary's things where Rosemary says she's going to leave her husband for a dude she calls Leopard. That's his nickname. And she's going to do it after her birthday. So that's kind of the big first clue, and that's what kind of gets Iris thinking about the circumstances of Rosemary's death. So this letter was written by Rosemary, and it was unsent. So either someone stopped her from sending it, or she changed her mind, or it wasn't Rosemary's at all and it was planted, but it's, by all accounts, it seems to be Rosemary was intending on leaving her husband. It didn't say anything about how much she hated her husband, just that, like, she fell in love with this other guy. So Iris, after finding this note, thinks it could be either one of two potential lovers, Stephen Faraday or Anthony Brown. Stephen Faraday is a rising politician. He's not very warm, he's not very fuzzy, but apparently he and Rosemary were close. And Iris is like, I don't know what she would see in him other than the fact that he might be prime minister one day, and maybe she was attracted by that. The complicated thing is that Stephen has a wife, Alexandra, who is apparently completely devoted to her husband. She comes from a very rich family and kind of gave up her inheritance to marry Stephen. Apparently, Rosemary, we find out later, didn't really like Sandra. She kind of made fun of her after, when the lady wasn't around. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Stephen is definitely the guy she was sleeping with. And then the other potential guy is Anthony. We call him Tony. He might be American. She's not sure. And Rosemary and him were close friends. They went to parties all the time. I think he works in politics. It was like kind of hinted at that he like works with the UN and possibly arms. I think he might be like wrapped up in some like arms dealing situation. I feel like we're gonna find that out later. But Iris has like a huge crush on this guy. They kind of start dating, it seems like, and she's really hoping that it wasn't him, because obviously that would be weird. And apparently, so he stopped coming around after Rosemary's death, which Iris is like, well, obviously, because like, he was Rosemary's friend. He's not going to keep coming around the rest of the people that he wasn't friends with. But then he starts hanging out with Iris. They kind of like bump into each other. But then she realizes that he'll never come to the house. He refuses any invitations to come back to the house for anything, which I think is interesting. I don't think it was Tony, but I think he's an interesting guy. I'd be surprised if he was actually the guy that Rosemary was sleeping with. I think it's not one of those two. I feel like those are red herrings, but we'll see. And the last person that I want to mention is Ruth Lessing. She's George's secretary. So the husband's secretary. She's hot. She's efficient. She secretly hated Rosemary. It really seems like Ruth is like this perfect secretary. She's very cold and detached and just completely organized, and kind of, they say that it's implied that she runs George. So she's, I guess, basically his like assistant slash doing a lot of the activities that I think a wife might be expected to do in a less wealthy household, like picking out all his clothes and making sure he has the right friends for like his career and like all of that stuff that you would be expected to do in that kind of time period. So I think Ruth and George are going to get together at some point, but it hasn't been mentioned that there's been any infidelity between them. So those are all the characters. I know it's a little bit much. I don't know a whole lot about anybody in particular. We haven't met anyone other than George, essentially. This is all just like telling, like, Iris is kind of talking about all of these people in Rosemary's life. So we haven't like seen them interact in any way, and we haven't gotten a perspective outside of Iris. We don't know how reliable a narrator she is. It doesn't seem like she's all that observant about other people. So I'm guessing that not all of this information is going to be factual, but that's kind of the stage. The stage has been set. Okay, so let's talk about some clues. So the next thing that's happening is that George is starting to ask some questions about Rosemary's suicide. Iris thinks that he found out that Rosemary was having an affair and kind of wants to understand what happened, which seems right. Sure, he was bound to find out sometime. And then we find out that George has bought a new country house. Lucky for him. Just a spare house, just for funsies. It's kind of a fixer-upper, but it's right next door to the Faradays. Stephen and Alexandra Faraday. Stephen, the guy that Rosemary might have been banging. So Iris thinks that's kind of suspicious. She thinks that George bought the house just to get close to them. Which, can you imagine? Just being able to buy a house just to get close to your enemy? Not in this economy. So that's kind of where we're at. Iris and George and Lucilla Drake are all at this country house. And I think we're gonna meet Stephen and Alexandra pretty soon. My theory at this point is, I think maybe Rosemary and Victor. I think maybe Rosemary and Victor were together because Victor is the only other guy in this equation. And obviously she wouldn't have been a lesbian in an Agatha Christie novel. So I think Victor is Leopard, and I think she decided at the very end not to run away with him. I don't know if he's the killer, but I don't think it's George. It might be Stephen, like Stephen being jealous that she was running off with some other man. It seems like he would have the kind of cold temperament to be like, fuck you, either I get you or no one has you. I could be Lucilla Drake. Maybe she killed Rosemary for money to help out her son. Victor seems like too much of a bad boy. I don't think that he's the guy. It could be Ruth. I mean, she's certainly... If this was a real life murder and it wasn't George, I would assume it was Ruth, just because she has kind of like so much control over Rosemary's life and so much access to Rosemary's life through George that she could plan anything, and she's the kind of person who plans things very well. But I don't. So, okay. Pretty sure... Okay, so my top pick is Stephen. My second pick is Ruth. It was pretty obvious that someone was poisoning her recurrently up until the final dose. Which again is another point in Ruth's favor. Maybe Ruth is my top suspect. Stephen is number 2. And then we'll throw in Victor as a wild card, because I'm pretty sure they were boning. Okay. I'll see you after the next part, and we'll see if anything has changed. Okay, so I've read 4 more chapters. Each of these chapters has been from a different suspect's point of view, so we have a lot more information about motive, and a couple of my theories are already wrong. So we're off to a good start at solving this. Okay, so the next chapter is in Ruth's point of view. Ruth is the secretary. We find out that Lucilla Drake and Victor Drake are cousins of Rosemary's. So my theory about them hooking up, probably not. We would hope not. Um, so that's already a bust. We find out that George, Rosemary's husband, um, paid Victor to leave and go out to Argentina because he was asking Rosemary for money. Apparently, Victor already got a little bit of money out of Rosemary. And yeah, Victor just seems like the kind of person who just mooches off of everyone. We get a scene where Ruth and Victor are talking, where Victor says if anything happens to Rosemary, Ruth would, of course, marry George. And Ruth thinks about that and is like, yeah, totally. I would totally marry George. I'm basically already his wife. Like, she does everything for him. So we have a little bit of motive there. You know, marrying a rich guy. Always a good motive. I still like her for this. We also get a moment where Ruth says that she wishes Rosemary would die. Apparently there was like, this feels like a weird rich people snub thing, but apparently Rosemary invited Ruth to this party and then only because of George, and then uninvited her because they needed the spot for someone else. And Ruth took this really hard. Like, it's a shitty thing to do to someone, to uninvite them to a party they wanted to go to. But also, I don't know that I would want to kill someone over it. I think the stealing her husband thing is much more likely. So, yeah. Ruth is a little intense. And then we get a chapter from Anthony's point of view, Tony's point of view, where we see that Tony is a liar, liar, pants on fire, and that Rosemary said that she knows his real name, which apparently she got from Victor because Victor and Anthony were in prison together, prison buddies, and Tony says, if you tell anyone, I'm going to kill you. And then Rosemary promptly invites him to her birthday party and insists that he must come. It's no wonder this woman got murdered. I'm sorry. How can you be that clueless? I don't want to victim shame, but Rosemary, girl. If someone threatens to kill you, don't invite them to your birthday party. That feels... Next we get a chapter from Stephen's point of view where we find out that he is the guy that Rosemary is sleeping with. So, not great. But it's exactly what Iris thought. We find out that leopard is a nickname from a kind of racist inside joke that they had. Which isn't great. Stephen just seems like a bit of a dick, too. We find out how he met his wife, and that he likes her, but he's not, like, passionately in love with her or anything. They're just, like, good friends, I guess. We find out that when they first met, he pretended not to know who she was and didn't want him to know who he was either because she's like from a very rich family and he isn't. And then he proceeded to stalk her and sit outside her house for days trying to wait until he could bump into her when she was alone. Can't think of anything more red flaggy than that. No. So he's a fucking creep. And we find out that as his affair with Rosemary intensified, Rosemary was like, you're never spending any time with me. Why don't we run off together? I'll just leave my husband. And he's like, I don't fucking want that. I'm not going to leave my wife. I'm not going to leave my career. Because that's the thing he cares about. So she was really pressuring him to leave his wife and like run off with her. And he's like, we got to end this. This is not good. I don't want to end it before a birthday party. She's going to like have this whole fit about it. So he's like thinking about how he wishes that he could just poison her and get her out of the way. Again, Rosemary, bad judge of character. Bad judge of character. Oh, and every single chapter, they have mentioned how stupid they think Rosemary is. None of her friends liked her. Kind of sad. Although, judging by the people she surrounded herself with, maybe they do have a point that she wasn't the brightest. The next chapter is from Alexander's point of view, so Stephen's wife. She is obsessed with her husband. Her husband is her whole life. She knew that Rosemary was having an affair with her husband, but she was like, my husband will never leave me. So it's fine, I guess. Which is an interesting reaction. We do have a moment in Alexandra's point of view where she says that she wishes Rosemary's flu would have killed her. Which I think she, out of everyone, has the most reasonable motive for murder. It's like, yeah, you've been fucking my husband. Yeah, I kind of wish you would die. Like, that seems reasonable. But after all of this, I think I still like Ruth for this. She has both a good motive in, like, she's in love with George, or as close to love as that kind of thing is. It feels like she's in love with George, and she would gain a lot of money from it, and she also didn't like Rosemary, and she also had the most opportunity of everyone to slowly be poisoning Rosemary. So I feel like she's still my favorite for this. Stephen is a good second choice, but because I feel like he's maybe the most obvious choice now, that makes me think that he's not the choice. It's a whole, like, reverse psychology thing with Agatha Christie's. But I do like that we've gotten a lot more context. I feel like we're going to kind of get some more insight into what happened in the birthday party very shortly. So I feel like once I see that, I'll have a better picture of what's going on. We also haven't been introduced to any detectives yet. So I don't know if, like, Iris is going to solve the crime. George and Iris have now, like, paired up, and George is like, I received these letters that said that, yeah, I didn't mention that. Big clue. George received a bunch of letters anonymously that said that Rosemary didn't kill herself. And now he's a little suspicious. So George is asking Iris to, like, think back and, like, help him figure things out, which strongly implies that he didn't do it. So I feel like George and Iris are probably in the clear, and it's the rest of them that are suspicious. So I don't know if they're going to be able to solve the crime or if we're going to get introduced to a detective later. I guess we'll find out. But yeah, I think Ruth is still my top girl. I think she's been slowly poisoning her, and then at the birthday party it would have been easy enough to just slip something into her drink. Okay, let's see how this pans out. Okay, some things are definitely starting to happen here. So George comes up with this plan to go and reenact the dinner that Rosemary died in. Obviously, we all saw this coming. He's doing it under the guise of, well, Iris's doctor says that she's under a lot of stress, and if she should just go back and have a nice dinner at the same place, at the same table, with the same people where her sister died, she'll be fine. Psychology. So under that guise, he's invited everybody. Nobody wants to go, but they're like, can't really get out of it, I guess. They're also deciding to do this for Iris's 18th birthday, realizing that she's now 18. I thought she was like 19 or 20. She's 17, which makes it all the much more awkward when Tony asks her to marry him. Tony, the man who I believe is, at the very least, 25 and a felon, if not, like, in his 30s, who was also into her sister, which is awkward, her dead sister. Iris is like, this is a bad time. George would be upset. We find out that George is her, like, guardian, her trustee person, as well as Rosemary was, I imagine. And Tony is like, he says this to Iris when she says that, like, now is not the time. My sister just died. George needs me. He says, darling morbid idiot, forget Rosemary. Only think of me. What a thing to say to someone whose sister was murdered. What a thing. Okay, and now we are also introduced to Colonel Rayce, who is someone that George is inviting because he knows that the guy worked at MI5. So he's not like a detective, but he's, you know, the closest that George can get, apparently. And Colonel Rayce is like, this is a terrible idea, don't do it. George does not listen, of course, because why would he? George is murdered at the table at Iris's birthday party in the same way that Rosemary was, presumably because the murderer knew that George would figure it out if they reenacted it. So George is dead. He's struck off the suspect list. It also makes it slightly less likely, I think, that Ruth murdered him, but I'm still sticking with Ruth as my main suspect. We're still sticking there. 2 other clues have come up for Rosemary's murder, not necessarily George's. One is that Stephen Faraday was on her right hand, so he had the most access to the glass. Their argument is that the person who was sitting on her left would have had to reach over her to poison her glass, where the person sitting on her right would have just been able to plop it in. So I don't know how real that was. You just, oh, look over there. I think both people, but they don't mention who was sitting on the other side. They just know that Stephen Faraday definitely had motive and means, as well as the fact that there were 3 men and 4 women, and everybody was dancing, which meant that any of the women at one time would have been left alone at the table while everybody else was dancing. So all of the women had equal opportunity to do it. So yeah, that's where we're at. We're still going to go with Ruth. Stephen just is being painted as the best suspect, but I really don't think so. We'll see. Okay, so we now have a detective. His name is Chief Inspector Kemp. We are unclear about whether or not he's actually a good inspector or just a bumbling inspector, and Colonel Rayce is going to solve it at the end anyway. I'm surprised that a detective of some sort that I'm familiar with didn't show up, but apparently this is just a one-off of hers. Anyway, down to the clues. So we have a few final clues, and then I think it's the big reveal. So we're going to run down all the clues. We're going to do a review of how I think the murder happened, and then we're going to see if I'm right. So we know now, after all of the interrogations with Chief Inspector Kemp, that Tony has access to sensitive military info, which I think is a red herring. I don't think this has anything to do with Tony trying to lock down military secrets, but that was a clue. We also find out after interviewing the waiters that were present at the dinner that Iris's bag fell on the floor, and one of the waiters picked it up and put it back on the table. This is most interesting when we later find out that Iris says that someone planted the packet. So the cyanide would have been administered in a powder form, and it would have had a little medicinal packet, a paper, to hold it so you could dip it in. Apparently this is how a lot of pills were taken back in the day. You would put your aspirin in a packet and then just kind of take it that way. So we find out that someone planted, allegedly, the packet that was probably used to keep the cyanide for George in Iris's bag. When you consider that the bag was left on the floor and anybody could have tipped it over, the waiter could have been paid to plant something in it. We also find out that it would have been very easy for any of the women in the bathroom when they were all touching up to slip something into her bag, because they were all right there and their bags were in front of them. But it seems like everyone had an opportunity to plant something in it if Iris didn't do it herself. Tony, because he's dating Iris, insists that Iris tell the police. Iris doesn't want to because she's this is evidence. It was in my bag. I don't want to hang for this, which I think is fair. And then we get a scene where Tony, Colonel Rayce, and Chief Inspector Kemp are all talking about what they think happened. So Kemp, the inspector, thinks that it's Alexandra, which I think it means it can't possibly be her. Tony thinks it's Ruth, but he also later says it's probably a ghost. It was the ghost of Rosemary who poisoned George. He says, quote, "Any spirit can make cyanide out of ectoplasm very seriously." So I'm not holding Tony's word with any sense of credibility, because he seems a little loony right now. The Colonel Rayce, thinks that it's Iris. It really seems like everyone had equal opportunity, everyone had equal motive. I'm not getting the sense that there's a clue that I've missed that's oh, it's definitely this person. It feels like it's equally everybody could have done it. It's not about alibis or anything. There's no breaking down an alibi. Everybody was there. Everybody was left unattended at some point. It seems like it's easier for the women to have done it, but that doesn't mean that it definitely was. I feel like Alexandra doesn't have enough motive. I know that Stephen was sleeping with Rosemary and George was maybe about to figure it out, but it makes sense for her to kill Rosemary, but not for her to kill George. And she knew about the affair the whole time, so I don't really think that, like, I don't know. She seemed kind of okay with the affair. She was like, he's never gonna leave me anyway, and, like, while I think she was angry about it, I don't think she was angry enough to kill about it. I still like Ruth for this. I still like Stephen for this. I feel like it's possible that Ruth and Stephen were boning, because they seem like they would go together well, but also Stephen is clearly not going to do anything about Alexandra. He needs Alexandra for his career, so he's never going to dump her, and Ruth kind of needs him to marry her, or needs a rich man to marry her. I don't think it's Tony. Tony seemed like an idiot. I don't think he could pull it off. I don't think George committed suicide. I think I'm going to say that it's Ruth. Ruth had every opportunity to poison Rosemary and make her sick, so that the theory of depression after influenza, which everybody keeps talking about like it's a thing, is believed. She had ample opportunity to put something in the glass when the lights went out. She had ample opportunity to plant the packet on Iris. She had ample motive. She would have been close enough to George to know if he was close to figuring it out. So I think probably, I think we're gonna go with Ruth did it. But I also don't feel like I have all of the information. I think there's a clue there that has something to do with the lights going out when Rosemary was killed. But what could that possibly mean? I don't get it. I don't think I figured this one out. But I also feel like maybe Agatha cheated a little and didn't give me all the info. So, let's see what the end is like and see if I got it right. Okay, so I'm not the best detective, but I'm not the worst either. It was Ruth. And here's how. So, Ruth and the ne'er-do-well, Victor, they were in love. Victor wanted Rosemary's money, and the best way to get that was to bump off Rosemary, then bump off Iris, and then all of their money would go to Lucilla Drake, his mother. And of course, all of his mother's money was essentially his money because he's a dick. So his plan was to murder Rosemary and then murder Iris. He accidentally ended up murdering George because all of their plates got switched around based on the bag falling over. Essentially, the bag was put by the wrong plate, and because it's a circle, everybody just, like, moved over one space. So George, who was sitting next to Iris, got the bad one when he wasn't supposed to. But essentially, their plan was to murder those two, have all the money go to Lucilla, and then she would marry George, and everything would be great, and they would just conduct an illicit affair together behind the scenes, and Victor would be fabulously rich. So Ruth hid the fact that Victor was back in the country. She also planted the cyanide thing in Iris's bag to make it look more like a suicide. And Victor just put everything in the glasses because he dressed up as the same waiter that they had had before. And because he was such a good actor, nobody thought twice, which kind of makes sense. So I was partially right. I still feel like I didn't have all of the information. They were talking about Victor being at another table, but I don't know. That seems... Sure, anyone in the restaurant could have done it, I guess. It does make sense. I wish it had been Lucilla Drake. I feel like that would have been a more compelling thing, that she, like, loved her son enough that she murdered for him. I think that would have been better. But, hey, I got it 50% right. Let me know if you saw this coming from the very beginning, what you thought, If you thought this was solvable, let me know. If you want me to do this again, comment down below and maybe we can do this again with a different mystery. Later.